We will continue now with our discussion of labor management negotiations. Our next interview is with Mr. Kermit Francis, Employee Relations Administrator for the City of Pasadena, California. In addition, Kermit is a member of the Board of Directors of the National Public Employer Relations Association and District Chairman of the Personnel and Industrial Relations Association. In our conversation, Kermit focuses on the importance of how he develops credibility with employees and their bargaining agents, and how this credibility is critical to gaining leverage in labor management disputes. As we discuss this further, he indicates the methods and techniques by which he uses this leverage for constructive settlements. In particular, he describes how to identify the real issues at the bargaining table and how to build an open problem-solving climate with union representatives. Kermit, do you have any approach or style that you use to develop leverage in labor management negotiations in the public sector?
Very typical of government negotiations, you'll have negotiating committees of 6, 8, or 10 people who are convinced that you don't understand their problems. So I find it very helpful to have high visibility in the field during the course of the year, to spend a lot of time out in the field talking with the employees, maybe even engaging in some work activity or helping them with something, helping them resolve individual and personal problems throughout the year. Then when you get to the table, there's a feeling that, well, you really do understand what's going on and you're trying to help them solve their problems. And by the same token, you can ask them to help you solve your problems, which are often financial, sometimes organizational.
Do you have to adapt your style with different unions as a basis for identifying their real needs and concerns?
Yeah, you cannot deal with every bargaining unit in an identical manner. You know, you have to adapt your style, your approach to the people you're talking to. Often you'll find that you have to resolve a lot of personal problems with one unit, maybe of the people at the bargaining table. You know, if you can solve 2 or 3 grievance discipline issues that are pending, going into the negotiations, the whole thing smooths out. You can get into very hostile negotiations sometimes, and you believe that you know, you're not submitting enough money, you're not giving them a good enough proposal on their retirement, and what the real problem is, you didn't paint the facilities that they use from day to day, and the drapes over there are very old, and they've been trying to get the carpet replaced for 5 years, and nobody's done that, and they're really upset. And if you make those changes, what you perceive to be the problems disappear. And I've experienced that in negotiating with police officers, where we completely misread where our problems were. So it's always very helpful early in negotiations if you can solicit some of these individualized departmental personal problems, which are actually outside of the compensation plan. Or there are problems that deal with the rules and regulations that are creating internal conflicts in an organization. And therefore you're dealing with a hostile group rather than a friendly group. Very often in negotiations you deal with so many contingent problems that don't deal with the key issue. If you have a key issue that you're not going to make a change in a certain area, whether it be vacation, holiday, retirement, or work rules, when you get into that discussion, there's an awful lot of things that come up. And you can show a great deal of flexibility, but when it comes down to the time of signing that contract, you haven't changed your basic position. You're going to move in a certain direction. So it's a perception problem. You have to really understand where you're going to begin with, and whether you've made a change on any major or significant item. And of course, the people on the other side of the table never know that. And you can appear to be very flexible, where in fact you have accomplished your goal and maintained a very hard line.
What are some specific ways in which you are able to get across to your opponent that you're being flexible without making actual concessions? How do you go about doing that?
Well, one easy way is to try to find out where we've had a problem. Often you'll get into a philosophical discussion about some point that the employer wants, and it'll be opposed. And if you can ask, well, now, where will this create problems for you? And then you find that they'll give you 5 or 6 examples of the problems that it'll create. So then you deal with those problems and you resolve those problems. Then you get back to the philosophy again and you say, now see, with this change, we can actually deal with those individual problems, and in fact we have, and we can institute this modification in a policy. As you solve, as I said before, people's personal problems or take care of their personal needs, you have a better opportunity to make the significant policy decisions consistent with your goals rather than, say, the goals of the labor organization.
Let me check that a little bit further, Kermit. Are you saying that quite often the issues that are brought to the bargaining table aren't the real issues? That there are other factors involved that are playing an important part in what's happening at the bargaining table?
And no question about it. That, particularly when you're dealing with a negotiating committee that's comprised of employees. Say in an enterprise that has 2,000 or less employees, which has been my experience. When I've gone into a situation with a fairly good-sized bargaining unit and been led to believe that we had all big problems, no little problems, that was actually not the case, and that when we started working early in the year to resolve people's individual personal problems, we developed a strong credibility. We were able to be very convincing in showing that we did have a competitive pay plan. And one thing is really important: if you've got a crappy compensation plan, it doesn't matter what kind of problems you solve, you have to be relatively competitive. My perception is that many companies with excellent compensation plans have significant labor problems because they're not dealing with the people and they're not up front at the bargaining table, and that if you get down and deal with the people and solve individualized problems, you're able to show people are listening to what you're saying about your compensation plan and where you're going and what makes sense and what doesn't. Otherwise, you get shut out, and you can talk forever. You could bring in the best, most logical speaker that there is, and they shut you out right now because they know they're getting screwed. And they tell their business agent. I've had that happen where you deal with a business agent, he says, God, you guys got a good plan and you're reasonable, but we're never going to sell it because the employees know that you're screwing them. And then they start telling you where the problems are. Mm-hmm. And very often I find that they're correct, and that we often have management and mid-management problems that need to be straightened out. And once that happens, our labor negotiations take on a completely different atmosphere, attitude. Okay,
I think you're saying something important regarding some possibly long-term trends in labor management negotiations. Can a constructive approach, or more constructive approach, as opposed to win-lose negotiations, be facilitated if managers do a better job managing?
Yeah, I think that's the key to the whole thing. Is when I've gone to work in a new enterprise, and I'm supposed to come in and negotiate the labor contract, the first thing I do is not sit down and try to meet the people that represent the labor union. Is I try to get a meeting of line managers together and sit down and ask them what some of the problems are, and then immediately take action to solve some problem, whether it be changing the tire on a truck or changing an employee evaluation form, something that they perceive to be a problem, and convince management that whether it's a problem or not, it's perceived to be a problem by their people, by their managers, and until they change that, that's going to be an obstacle to their being successful in communicating with the managers. They feel that their opinions aren't considered. You have to get away from the right-wrong attitude of management, I think, is a first step, and get into one where things are just different, and there are a lot of different ways that the same thing can be accomplished. And if you get the input from some of your mid-management people and allow them to make some modifications and changes, you begin to develop that support. They get some credibility with their employees down the line, and then that, I find, is reflected at the bargaining table.
Sounds like you're going to some of the root causes of what types of conflicts or problems arise between labor and management. Is that realistic given today's environment?
I believe it's absolutely realistic. Many public and private businesses that I'm familiar with have excellent compensation plans and terrible troubles with their labor unions. You're not dealing with the root causes, you're not dealing with the problem. And each negotiations will be hard, difficult, frustrating. It'll wear out a lot of people. And the next time that contract comes up, you're going to go through the same thing all over again. I mean, there's no panacea, obviously, but it's a lot easier, I've found, if you start dealing with the root causes, as you call them, dealing with the people, solving the individual problems, working with your management personnel. When I was with a small organization, it was explained to me by somebody much smarter than I that that works fine when you know everybody, but you can't do it with a bigger operation. Well, and I tried it with a little bit bigger operation. I find that you have to rely more on other people to do what you can do individually as a labor negotiator, employee relations person. But if you spend the time with the other people and convince them that this is a way to go, that message does get carried back and you do get the positive results. And at this organization, we have some units that are fairly large, 500 employees in a bargaining unit, and I find that that's the first unit I attacked, if you want to use that word, because that's where our major problems were when I came to the city, and I find it's the most responsive. If you take the biggest problem and work on it and try to apply the principles, deal with the root causes, pretty soon people are coming to their managers, the managers are coming to their department heads, and you have to deal through a long chain of command to resolve some problems. But there are many tenets to it. Accountability of supervisors, having more authority to utilize their own decisions and to succeed and fail. It gets kind of far afield, but that's really where I think negotiations is. It's not the preparation. I mean, it's the game. If you wanted to make an analogy with an athletic contest, but if you haven't done the months of practice and preparation and input, you're never going to succeed in the game. Or if you do, it'll be brutal and a lot of people will get hurt, and the next game is going to be the same way. If you just try to go in and play the game without preparing for it.
How do you plan, let me take off from what you've just said, how do you plan a strategy when you're ready to face a particular negotiation?
Well, how do you plan a strategy? That's kind of a difficult question. Probably be easier to say if you're working in an environment where you have been for a while and you've spent your time in the field dealing with the employees, and you have a number of people that have their ears open to what the problems may be. Early, 2 months before negotiations begin, you meet to try to perceive what the real problems are with this organization. Not the compensation plan, but real problems that people are having with their supervision, with equipment that they're utilizing, with operations and attitude of the city, and see what those are and see how well you can resolve those. That's the key thing to preparation. Secondly, you do some standard mechanical things like compare your compensation plan with other plans, analyze the economic conditions of the community, the state, the country. I find that I spend a lot of time reading publications like the Survey of Business Practice to find out what direction things seem to be going.
Cost of living.
Cost of living index. I spend a lot of time analyzing that. It's not as valuable a tool as people have been led to believe it might be. The value comes in the fact that a lot of people believe it's good, therefore you must be able to deal with it in a negotiating situation. So you have to have a very thorough and complete understanding of what the Consumer Price Index is, how it works, what it does do, what it doesn't do, so that you can be persuasive at the bargaining table and not get trapped. I analyze a lot of labor contracts that are multi-year because they directly impact what's going to happen in the current year, in their second and third years of there. So those are key things in preparation. Doing some individual analysis of your own plan. I have prepared. We're not doing it in this jurisdiction yet, but it's a statement of total compensation that goes to each individual employee, which shows how much money the city paid to you as an employee or to someone else on your behalf. What does it cost us to have you on the job? I find you don't have to use that as you negotiate, but it sure helps to raise the awareness level of all the employees you're dealing with as to what the real costs are, if they were running the business. And if you mention that during the course of the year from time to time, it has a very interesting impact when you get to the bargaining table.
Kermit, there are various types of situations that a negotiator faces and different types of strategies in which negotiators operate from. One that we're particularly interested in looking at is negotiating for mutual gain. And by that I mean a situation in which the two parties really attempt to come to a settlement which meets the needs of both parties. Not that the needs change, but they seek a solution which is really to the advantage of both parties. It's not bargaining, it's not compromising, but the settlement is really one in which both parties feel fully satisfied. It's been some type of creative problem-solving approach to the conflict or to the issues that are brought to the bargaining table. Let me ask you this question. Under what conditions should a negotiator attempt to collaborate and seek a solution which will be mutually advantageous?
I think that should be his primary goal all the time. It's been my experience that whoever you work for, and I work both public and private, that what the enterprise is attempting to do is maximize its profit or its influence or its share of the market. And there are a number of techniques that they will use to do that. Now, to the extent that through the negotiating process you can achieve something which allows the enterprise to achieve a step towards its goal, and at the same time you can achieve a step towards the goal of the employee, you're bargaining for mutual gain. And a quick example is when you reduce the workforce and increase the pay scale of those people that remain, and the total payroll drops. Mm-hmm. So you have fewer people working more efficiently, working smarter, working differently, however you want to phrase it, so that they're satisfied. They feel they've got a bigger share of the pie. If economic gain is the mutual goal they want, you've reduced your total operating costs for personnel, one of your variable costs, as it's referred to. So now there's a mutual gain there. You've had a reduction in staff, which may not have been the key, or what you were attempting to do. What you were attempting to do was reduce one of your variable costs. And through the negotiating posture, you were able to figure something out that allowed that to happen. That's a mutual gain. It's also been my experience that there is not an attempt at this point in time for the business enterprise to hold back the employee. I don't find that there are people that hold with tenants, pay them as little as you can and work them as hard as you can and as long as you can, but to try to maximize the productivity of the individual. That seems to be the goal. Try to improve the situation. And I really approach negotiations from the standpoint that whether I'm dealing with a union or an individual employee association or just dealing with the city council, board of directors of the corporation or the government entity, that what we're trying to do is improve things in an organized fashion that will do well for us as a business entity and do well for the people that work for us. So what I'm bargaining is not whether or not we change things, but only the rate at which this change will occur. And from time to time, if you get involved in some new, quote, innovative, actually most innovative things that I've run across are new kinds of guarantees that somebody's looking for. For example, the employer wants higher productivity, wants that guarantee as a part of the bargaining process. Mm-hmm. The employee wants guaranteed annual wage as part of the bargaining process. So those are referred to as innovative things. Well, they're new and different. If they fit into the goals of the enterprise, if there's a way you can fit that productivity goal into the employee's program, or you can fit the guaranteed annual wage into the employer's program, well, then you've really got something. You do have some mutual gain. But I think it's key to remember that we're not very often arguing whether or not we do something. We're only arguing about, and it is an argument, the negotiation process. It's a discussion. We're arguing about at what rate shall this change occur in this prosperous economy in the United States that we're dealing with. To say that we're doing something other than that, I think, shows a flaw in the reasoning of the individual.
How do you go about establishing the right climate with the opposing party so that mutual gain will occur in the negotiating process?
Well, I try to avoid the negative. When a new proposal comes to my attention, they say, we have to have that, rather than telling them, no, we're not going to do that. I'll say, well, maybe that makes some sense. I'll give you a good example. Let's have long service leave or sabbatical leave. That's often opposed.
That's a demand being made by the union.
Demand being made by the union that every so many years the employee gets 3, 4, 5 months off. And they give all their logical reasons why it's good for the individual. Well, if you personalize that, and it helps often to look at things, well, if I was on the other side, is this something that I'd enjoy? Not whether it's an economic benefit or does it make logical sense. Is it something I'd enjoy? And I find that often if I find that it's something I'd enjoy, that it's easier to understand, well, why are they making this demand? And they may not have a strong feeling they're going to accomplish this, but they're throwing it out. Rather than say no, I'd say, well, I don't really think the time for that kind of a change is now. You're trying to do something that may occur in the future, and it may make some sense. There are places where they do have that kind of a program, the teaching profession, but they have unique conditions. They close down for the summer. Maybe if governments close down for the summer, it would make sense here. But maybe there are other ways that you can operate that kind of enterprise. If you're going to pay someone to be off that long, does that fit into the current mechanisms we have in our compensation plans, which anticipate productivity for an entire year less maybe 30 days? And those 30 days are usually the vacation, sick time, or other time off that may occur for special reasons. So that maybe the timing's not right. And if you're looking at a continuum of things that are going to improve and change, it'll fit in there somewhere, perhaps. And I also try to point out that many changes that are demanded by a labor organization initially don't work out. A good example of that is the 4-day work week, 10 hours a day. Many enterprises have tried it with great success. Others, it was a complete failure. And it was a failure not always from the standpoint of the employer that put the program in place, but the employees. Many older employees found that they did not like to work 10 hours a day for an entire year. It was nice for a short run. That it disrupted the scheduling with their children that were in school on a 5-day week, with working spouses that had different work schedules. People that work on 24-hour shift basis found that it created some problems for them. So they really looked to a return to the 8-hour day. And there will be approaches to reduce that to 7.5 hours a day, that kind of thing.
Can you give us an example of where a union has come in with a demand and which is inconsistent with, say, what management wants, and you resolved the issue to the mutual benefit of both parties?
We had a labor organization that wanted a pretty standard demand. The demand was for fully paid medical insurance for the dependents of the employee. And the employer's position was that that was a benefit that could not be applied universally to all members of the union because of the 100-plus members in the union. Only 35 of them actually had dependent coverage on the insurance when an analysis was made. So it would mean that we were increasing the monthly compensation for those people by about $90 and not increasing the monthly compensation for the balance of the employees. This was a group of older employees in the unit primarily that had already raised their families, and some younger employees that hadn't started yet. So you had a very small percentage with the dependent coverage. So the compromise that was reached was that in consideration of an increase in the city's contribution to dependent medical care, that the salary for all employees would be increased a certain dollar amount, $20 or $30 or $40 a month. I forget exactly what the figure was. So this was put in the contract. So each employee received, as a part of their base salary, an increase above the negotiated wage settlement. Now this increase appeared as a part of their base wage from that point on. It gave the employer the opportunity to utilize that in comparison of salaries with other jurisdictions to see how we fit with the competitive wage rate. It gave the union the opportunity to tell their employees, we have got a increase in dependent coverage. We have almost full coverage now, and we have not been short-sighted as far as the majority of our employees were concerned. They were not aware coming in that the majority of their employees would not receive this benefit. So that worked out. The city did not philosophically want to become involved in dependent medical coverage. And they felt, well, they didn't. And the union felt, well, it's absolute. Now, each year when the contract comes up, we have a clause that talks about dependent medical coverage. So actually you had two people talking differently about the same thing to their mutually exclusive advantages.
What kind of methods do you use to establish an open problem-solving climate during negotiations?
I'm pretty direct. I just ask, what problems has this created for you? Where are we having the problem? Who's causing the problem? I try not to let the negotiators deal in generalities when they talk about something that obviously is an accepted problem that we all understand is a problem, and which I might agree with. Still ask them, well, specifically, where's the problem? Who's the problem with? How does it evidence itself? What do you think is a solution to it? Why is that a solution? And force them to explain, to do their homework, to be prepared before they come in. If I do that early, one, it helps me to actually resolve real problems. And two, it keeps them from embarrassing themselves at the table, realizing that if they speak in generalities, they better have the specifics or they'll look bad in front of their membership, if their membership's at the table. If it's a one-on-one negotiations, of course, the situation's a lot different, and you pretty much deal with what's it going to take to sign the agreement, rather than all the individual problems, which is fine, because I'd rather deal with the individual employer enterprise problems through our own management organization and meetings that we set up, and not have to deal with them at the bargaining table, because that does give us some leverage. We can say, well, these are problems that we discovered, that we encouraged you to talk about, that we resolved, and it's not something that the credit will go to the bargaining unit for. That's my preference. But on the other hand, I don't have any problems with allowing them to have their proper credit and their just due if we're resolving problems. That's what it's all about.
What do you do, though, if you feel that the opposing party is not being upfront, that they're purposely not being upfront? How do you confront that situation?
I'll usually get the individual alone after a negotiation session and to tell him straight up that I think he's lying to me, that he's giving me a lot of crap, and that we're not going to get any place. And if he has to do that, either one, for some reason he is not capable of dealing with the problems and the situations at hand, and he should be replaced, and I'll deal with his boss in the union, even if it's at the international level. Or two, I've usually found that the ones that have been around, that understand what they're doing. But let me back up a little bit. When that happens, I usually find two things. One, the person is new and doesn't understand, and is just being overly cautious. It's not a real intention to be not upfront, but is being overly cautious. Secondly, the person has a hidden agenda, so to speak. There's something else that's going on, and in talking to him one-on-one, that evidences itself, and then I just deal with it accordingly, and I understand that. Three, if the guy's just a lousy son of a bitch and is just trying to screw things around. That's different, and I usually deal with that by trying to apply some pressure through the union, particularly if I believe that he's not really addressing problems that I know his unit has. I will attempt to bring those up and embarrass him in the bargaining session. I need to have a productive effort in the negotiations process. Gaming is fine, and if you're detached from it and you understand that, you can deal with that. Sometimes you get thrown curves, intentionally. And I always try to figure out why someone is approaching things in a certain way.
In trying to identify what the real problem is, do you take any steps to ensure that the problem that's identified is the real one?
The first thing I attempt to do is say, where specifically does this create problems for us? Who and what? I also get back with the department, division, foreman, section, wherever the problem seems to be related, and talk to them. I spend a lot of time in preparing for negotiations dealing with the management, top management, mid-management personnel, to see if they have some perceptions of where problems are or are not. It's very seldom that something comes up that we haven't an idea about before the negotiations start. And it's just part of good preparation so that I'm able to relate to it. Another thing that I will do if we're dealing with operational or personal type problems, I'll set them aside in the negotiations and try to move on and deal with some other things that involve the entire contract. And then I will bring in or set up special separate meetings with personnel that I think can resolve the problem, whether it be a financial problem in the processing of payroll, or an understanding of our insurance programs, or some of our cost analysis, or if it's an operational problem in a department, if it's a problem between departments, if it requires outside expertise to explain. And I have no reservation about setting up side meetings or a part of a negotiating meeting that has as its purpose dealing with an individual problem. So I'd say the steps are, one, the preparation, and two, asking where specific problems are, three, getting back to the departments, and four, setting them aside and allowing the labor organization to hear firsthand from the people that I believe can deal with and resolve their problems.
How do you generate alternative solutions to a problem?
One, I ask, aren't there other ways that we can accomplish this? Two, again, if you're anticipating demand or a problem at the beginning, you need to see if there aren't some different approaches that could be utilized if this evidences itself or surfaces during the negotiations. And I find an excellent technique is to state why you believe you can't really resolve that problem at this time. And as you start giving reasons of the kinds of problems it would create for you, if you say you made a change in your compensation plan, as you're stating these problems that might be created, you get a reaction from the labor organization. And what I really attempt to do is indicate problems that I think I know the resolution to, and if they come up with the same resolution that I have, then I agree with their answer, which is an answer that I was prepared to propose, but it's much easier if they propose it. In the example I gave you earlier about the insurance case where they wanted dependent coverage, well, we had worked that out, but we never proposed that. Our feeling was, had we proposed it, it would never help. So we just continually said, well, the problem is 70 people would not get the benefit of it and only 30 people would. And finally, one of the people on their committee blurted out, well, why don't we do it this way and just give it to everybody, and that way you don't have to worry about it. So then I said, well, if we do that, see, now we'd switch from whether or not we did it to how do we do it. I said, how could we set it up? And there was a lot of discussion of different mechanisms that could be used, and finally it was suggested, well, put it in the payroll. Well, there's a tax on that. Well, how much is the tax? What's the average tax on that much money? Well, it's $2 or $3. So we split the difference and went from $1 figure to that same dollar figure plus $1.50. So it was their idea and their proposal, and we were accepting their proposal, but it was something that we were willing to accept. And to this day, they don't know that. So I hope they don't hear this tape.
Our next interview is with Mr. Frank Sweeten, Corporate Vice President for Sperry Rand Corporation for Management Development and Organization. Frank's career includes 16 years as an industrial relations specialist in the private sector. I asked Frank to describe the educational process a company must go through as a step in developing a realistic settlement range with union representatives.
I think it's very important that after the union has the opportunity of explaining its proposals, that the company, at the proper timing, establishes in the minds of the unions on the other side of the table and the employee representatives what the company sees as a realistic business environment. What the problems are the company's coping with. Are they in declining markets? Are there some pressures upon the company that are truly impacting the bargaining situation? Often the employee representatives, that is the day-to-day employees that are at the bargaining table, are aware of many of these problems as well. But it's important that the company establish the business environment they're in, what the problems are, so that the union representatives have an opportunity to evaluate their proposals in the realistic climate of the business situation. So you might say that's somewhat of an educational process on both sides. I mean, the company explaining its business environment, the union explaining what it feels its membership needs are. So it's a communicative process in which each side tries to help the other side understand its problems and what it has to deal with. Each side's educating the other a bit in this process. And generally speaking, it's the communication process is to develop understanding. And that understanding is the oil that tends to facilitate the negotiating process to come to a satisfactory conclusion. It represents a give and take by each relative to their views, attempting to accommodate each side's problems, working it out. Now that's in the broad sense. These, Ed, vary by the timing. I mean, you may start out 60-day notice from the union of intent to bargain over the expiration of the contract, but generally speaking, the latter weeks are the more intensive bargaining periods. So you've got a timing consideration in here. But along in the process, when you finally get to the economic area, I think it's essential that the company make it clear that they are knowledgeable in terms of what the union has been settling for elsewhere, that the union understand what the company's competitors have been settling for, and again attempt to narrow through this education process the extremes of the positions down to an area that gives the potential for the ultimate agreement.
In looking over your experiences, what are some of the best ways of developing compromise solutions? How would the company, for example, offer a compromise so that it's most effective? For example, if you're willing to compromise a certain amount, how do you make your compromise such that it's credible to the union that you're not going any further?
If the days and even weeks of bargaining that have gone on have probably laid the groundwork for a great deal of understanding of range within that's acceptable for reaching the agreement. For example, it's easier to talk perhaps in the wage area. The union has in its mind what they think is a reasonable basis for settling. what they would feel that they could sell to their membership. Same token, the company has an awareness of what it can handle from a competitive point of view in the way of an offer. So you've done a lot of educating in the process that we've talked about. The union knows that the company knows what they've settled for. The company's advised the union, if they haven't negotiated with their competitors, what those competitive settlements are. So you've got an identifiable range. Now, this is being a little oversimplistic, Ed, because it's a very complicated process in a way, but in concept, that's what it comes to. So you might be in a 3-year contract. Let's say you're 20, 30 cents apart at this point. Now, it's a little more difficult if a union is negotiating its first contract, because then they're trying to establish for the first time in the set of contracts with this particular, take the auto industry. Suppose the UAW is negotiating and has picked Ford to be the one they're going to try to get the first contract with. Well, that range or that area, ballpark, is less definable than it would be if the union had reached an agreement with Ford and was now going on to GM to extend that agreement with them. Okay, so it varies to some extent there, but absent a pattern setting situation where there have been some definable settlements that set somewhat of the stage here, then let's say you've got this 20 or 30 cent spread that you're trying to work out. I think when you've reached a point where you have some reason to feel that there's an understanding of what's in the ballpark, our approach has been to try to put on the table an offer that's realistic. If, let's say, the pattern settlement has been 40 cents an hour in the first year, there's no sense coming in with about 15 cents. The company's proposal, at least I feel from our strategy point of view, would be one to put a realistic proposal on the table that the union knows, the employee representatives at the bargaining table know. It's a good faith offer. I mean, it's obvious by its magnitude or size that it makes sense. It's not as if to say that it's everything they want, but when you've been at the bargaining table for a number of weeks, you generally know, and they know. That is, the union and the employee representatives know when the company's got something out that makes sense and is realistic in terms of what's going on around them.